Hello, hola, my beloved Latin America and my beloved Americas, and a very warm welcome to this plenary from me from a rather cold Cambridge this afternoon, English afternoon. So as you know, we will spend the next 40 minutes or so reflecting together about the kinds of collaborative approaches that support teachers in our professional learning and that stimulate and foster innovation. But before I begin, I would like to tap into your own experiences of collaborative learning in your own professional development and in your own schools and contexts, so that we can have the opportunity to think about how we learn with others and from colleagues. So I'll pause for a moment and let you think about these two questions. What was the last thing you learned from a colleague, and when was it? Can you remember? And in your experience, what approaches or activities are the most conducive for learning with and from colleagues? I'll let you think for a second. So, in this session, we are going to be looking at first at why learning together with other teachers is really important, but even more important now, as revealed by the experiences we've had during and as we emerge from the pandemic. Then we're going to look at what research has to say about effective collaboration between teachers. And finally, we're going to explore a couple of collaborative approaches for learning and innovating that can be applied in pretty much any and every context. Let's get started. So, as I said, we'll begin by exploring why learning together is even more important now than ever before. So, if you remember 2 years ago, the school closures caused by the COVID-related lockdown triggered a temporary but rather long dissolution of school, college and university communities, and also a physical dispersal and fragmentation from schools to individual homes, and therefore real brick and mortar classrooms and schools were replaced by virtual classrooms, virtual learning environments, virtual staff rooms. And COVID-19 has presented many new challenges for teachers and for teacher educators and managers, not only in teaching and connecting with students and teacher learners, but in our own learning as teachers and especially in the learning from one another. And the necessity of physical distancing has required all of us to engage in different types of networks. So I think a valid question to ask ourselves is the one that you can see now. How effectively has video conferencing software recreated school communities and staff rooms? And another question that you might want to consider is, to what extent did we succeed in creating social spaces in virtual environments to learn from and with each other? And I'm sure that the answer to this question varies from individual to individual, from group to group, and from school to school. But I think what is really important, and I suppose what, irrespective of how each of us feels about this, teachers all over the world are exhausted after 2 years of the most disruptive and isolating circumstances in both our personal and our professional lives. And this is why I believe that continuing to support each other in our learning during this time is particularly crucial. As we're emerging from the pandemic and going back to a new normal, now is the time to redefine not just how our students learn and thinking about the future, but also how we as educators create systems, procedures, etc. to better support our own learning. And the need for teacher support and collaboration between teachers, I think, is crucial in Latin America. I know this from my own experience of having lived and worked in Buenos Aires as a teacher in Argentina, as a teacher and teacher educator for 13 years before I moved to the UK, where I now lived. And when I look back at the manic rhythm of my working life, as what we called in Argentina, la profesora taxi, going to the different places I worked in, For example, from a corporate language school in the city of Buenos Aires area to my students' workplaces in different parts of the city, to a state secondary school, to a language school where I taught children and teens. It was so exhausting and stressful and lonely at times. So I think it was only after I had the opportunity to work in a completely different environment, for example, as I work now from the one school in the same building from 9 to 5 and being able to cycle to work, that I really became aware of how tiring, demanding and hectic my life back then was as a professora taxi. But when I was in the middle of it all, it was my normal and daily routine, and I didn't give it a moment's thought, to be honest. But let me tell you this, from the other side of the pond, if you like, of the Atlantic, what you do is amazing. It's extraordinary, and not many teachers in the world do what you do. And I know this because I'm in frequent contact with teachers from different parts of the world as part of my work. But I also know that it comes at a cost. And because you're immersed in it and it's normal, you might not be aware of it. And this is why I say it's crucial that teachers in Latin America have access to supportive environments and collaboration for innovation. So, as schools and colleges have reopened, many of us are asking ourselves, how can we support each other after so much uncertainty and isolation? And one important answer to this question that a lot of people have articulated was, well, let's focus even more on teacher well-being. And I say even more because teacher burnout and the need to look after the well-being of teachers has been a recurrent topic and concern in our field even before the pandemic. So I think, as I said, this topic is really important, and it does, of course, have a place and a function in teachers' lives and work. And here is a quote from a colleague of mine who kind of expresses this idea. So I'll let you read this for a second. But interestingly, teachers are different, and the current explicit focus on well-being in continuing professional development is not always appealing to every teacher. So here are a couple of quotes from another two colleagues that reflect this different view. So have a look. And another colleague, PD is professional development. As you may know, approaches to well-being draw on insights from positive psychology. And sometimes positive psychology, of course, it's got very many strengths, but it has also been criticized for its focus on the individual. And this is a quote from Cabañas and Illouz, and they say that positive psychology chooses to focus on happiness or well-being rather than more social concerns. So, for example, like solidarity, and that it articulates an underlying individualism and narrow sense of the social. And I kind of agree with that view. I'm all for self-care, and I do participate in self-care. Forgive me. Self-care is really, really important. But I believe, and I would agree, that it is absolutely necessary, but it's also an insufficient way to address the problems that teachers are encountering today and the support needs that they have. And this is why I really believe that learning together is crucial. And this is why collaborative teacher learning is so important, because it creates conditions in which teachers can learn together and can learn from and with each other. And this is, again, my same colleagues talking about the importance of learning together. This idea that you feel you're part of a team, that we're learning together, that you're trying to get through the challenges and the problems and the issues that we are all facing. And in other words, that we're all in it together in some way or another. So let's now focus on what research has to say about this idea of learning together and collaborating, learning from and with each other as teachers. In particular, I want to explore First, why it is important to collaborate in order to learn. Second, what does collaboration look like? In particular, what does effective, impactful collaboration look like? What is it made of? What are its building blocks? And when I talk about what research has to say, what I mean is not just a study or two, but I mean systematic reviews, i.e. research studies that collect and look at multiple studies. So let's explore why collaborate. Collin and Smith say that collaboration among teachers may promote development. And why? Because peers share, if you think about us as a group of teachers, we share a common language, we share a common culture, the culture of the profession, but also the culture of the institution and the country and the region where I work. And we share knowledge regarding the problems that we face together. But equally, a group of peers can provide both emotional help, and informational assistance. In other words, by working with colleagues, I become more informed. And all this supports a teacher in improving their practice. Now, just to make sure that we share an understanding of the terms that I will be using here, when I talk about effective, what I mean is impactful collaboration. And by this, I mean that when we collaborate between teachers in our continuing professional development activities and programs, ideally, this becomes transferable teacher learning, i.e. that what I learn as a teacher, I can transfer to my practice. I can enact it as I teach my students. And that hopefully that improved teacher learning and transferable teacher learning that has improved my practice leads to better student learning. So that's what I actually mean. So let's look at what research has to say. Now, interestingly, while collaboration is now generally considered integral to all professional development activities, creating conditions where the collaboration is genuinely contributing to improvements in teachers' practice remains quite elusive. And that's why I'm kind of putting that warning over there, that not all forms of collaboration between teachers are equally impactful. So another conclusion when you look across different research studies is that collaboration is necessary, but is not sufficient for effective continuing professional development. And interestingly, collaboration is linked to both positive outcomes and negative outcomes. In other words, it may lead to effective and ineffective professional development. This is why it's so important to be aware of what is and what isn't effective collaboration that leads to better learning. So here's a mnemonic that I came up with to help us try and remember the building blocks of impactful collaboration according to research. And it is the word Seep. And it's what that photo over there illustrates. So as you know, seep means to move gradually, to kind of filtrate and to penetrate, filtrarse, penetrar. So typically you see things like moisture seeping into the soil. So I'd like us to think of collaboration as seeping, fertile, fruitful, penetrating and permeating our own practice. So let's look at what Sims et al. Have concluded in terms of the ingredients, if you like, of effective collaboration. First of all, that effective collaboration is structured. And by this, I mean that it's planned and it's organized in such a way that it supports peer learning. So for you to support other peers and to be supported by peers, as opposed to unplanned, informal, ad hoc, or idiosyncratic forms of collaboration. Like, for example, you're in the staff room and it's a water cooler moment where you say, hey, I've got this idea. And it doesn't mean that that is not effective. The problem here is that unstructured collaboration may play an important part, but it's very difficult to evaluate, and B, is difficult for school leaders to actively promote. The second element is that effective collaboration is experimental. In other words, it encourages teachers to try out to refine and to embed new approaches together. So in other words, we collaborate to innovate. The third element, that E of the word Seep, is that collaboration is evidence-rich. And I'm not talking here about we sit together and read research reports. I mean, that's absolutely useful. But what we're talking here is of teachers studying their own practice and the impact that their practice has on their learners and their learning. So they study how learners are responding to the changes that they create or enact in their teaching practices. And finally, the P stands for problem-based. In other words, collaboration is focused on inquiry and on solving problems. So here are some quotes from other researchers that echo and illustrate that, those ideas that I've just presented. So this is Mary James, Professor Mary James, who says that collaborative and classroom-focused inquiry has greater power to change classroom practices and learning outcomes for the students, of course, for the better than any other factor in professional development. So quite a powerful statement. And that it involves tackling a real issue or a problem, but also it aims to develop practical solutions. So if I have a problem, let's find a solution together. And again, Mary James, that the process involves an action research or inquiry cycle of investigation. So investigating an issue, action, enacting some kind of solution, evaluation, so trying it out and evaluating, what impact it has, and then refining it. So I'm sure you are aware and familiar of action research or inquiry cycles of different types. And I'm sure in previous conferences, you looked at this in detail. But interestingly, Cordingly also adds that it is working through and reviewing together the effects of those new activities. And she says, very strongly, that disturb the status quo, that helps the teachers review their approaches, their beliefs and their assumptions through a fresh and reflective pair of eyes. So it's not about doing the same thing that we've always done, but it's actually quite the opposite. And finally, Doris Santoro says that whenever, and this is the impact of collaboration, whenever teachers are brought in to investigate, find solutions and develop interventions, i.e. new ways, new approaches, new models, you're creating opportunities for authentic community and taking action in a way that feels less isolating. And this is what really resonates to me in the post-pandemic recovery time, that this is really important. So I think it's important to understand that there are many different ways of collaborating that are more or less intensive. So let us, I'm going to share with you the insights from Collin and Smith, who create a little bit of a continuum from expert collaboration to more basic forms of collaboration, because not everybody has the time, the expertise in-house or the ability to buy, the resources to buy external expertise. So I think it's important to understand that there is more than one way of collaborating. So the first and most expert way that Collins and Smith suggest is what they call a coaching relationship. And by this, they mean an expert coach working with teachers and providing peer support and assistance. If we move to something a little less expert and towards something less time-consuming and resource-consuming, a second model could be regular conference calls between teachers. So as you see, this is online. It doesn't require people to meet face-to-face, but you can if you want to. And the idea is that peers discuss how they're finding learning and innovating. So this is, of course, working on the assumption that a group of teachers are trying to innovate together. So developing a new approach or a new technique or implementing a strategy for the first time. And what they do basically is they have conversations on a regular basis to support each other in the difficulties and the challenges of implementing something new. And then the third model, again, going to something less expert and more basic, is at least two colleagues taking part together in some form of training. So a course, a webinar series, a conference, etc. but the idea here is that they go together to support each other. So they attend the professional development event together, and then they try to implement it together, and they support each other throughout the implementation of whatever they decide to implement. I think it's equally important to understand what constitutes an impactful collaboration. And he accordingly tells us three things. Number one, an impactful collaboration focuses on describing and sharing existing practices rather than refining new ones. In other words, if we keep doing what we've always done, we make little difference. And that's why it's not really very impactful. The second factor here is if we always and only focus on the teaching, this is rather than the students learning. So we keep looking at my techniques, my approaches, my strategies, but we don't look at the effect, how they're affecting our learners, whether they're helping our learners learn better, etc., is not really very impactful in terms of achieving better outcomes for our students. And finally, an impactful collaboration basically builds a professional learning community as an end in itself. So it's a little bit like a therapeutic or friendly group, rather than as an environment in which it is safe to explore evidence and to improve practice. Now, let me give you a concrete example of why, quite a few researchers saying that this idea that's pretty much everywhere of sharing good practice is not necessarily impactful collaboration. First of all, before I even begin with the example, the point here is that the concept of good practice is already problematic, because when I say good practice, what do I mean? For whom? According to whom? Who says so? In what contexts and circumstances? But then let's look at, for example, the typical what people call the inset session, in-service training session, or that some people call it the teach meet, where, for example, let's imagine Danny, the first teacher in a session that lasts 60 minutes, shares good practice on using Canva. He's been experimenting with Canva, and he talks to us for 20 minutes about, the way he uses Canva with his students. And then we have Maria, who spends another 20 minutes talking to us about how she's, experimented with Mentimeter on her students. And then we move to Florencia, who uses Padlet and has been using Padlet, and she shares with us how she's been using Padlet for 20 minutes. The result of this, more often than not, is that is death, what I would say death by here's another one. Here's another idea, here's another idea, here's another idea. So there's lots of quantity, which leads to very superficial coverage and to excessive cognitive load. So this is very unlikely to lead to changes in my practice after being to this session. And let's stop here for a minute, because I think it's really important to understand and remind ourselves what teachers learn for. And Wesson and Clay talk about three different outcomes of professional learning activities. So at the most basic, as teachers, we learn to understand concepts and theories and to be aware of new ideas. So, for example, when you come into this conference, that's precisely what we do. We hear people express their thoughts, their ideas, their approaches, and we become aware of them. And the outcome of this kind of training activity or professional development activity could be construed as awareness and inspiration. So I'm inspired. But Wesson and Clay say, okay, so in order for that to become part of my professional practice, then I need to be able to move on to the second level, which is to operate systems, procedures, approaches, etc. In other words, to use and apply what I have learned. And then the deepest level, and ideally what we would hope for, because this is what constitutes impactful professional development, is to implement, to refine, to evaluate, and embed new practices. And this is what actually creates direct impact on learners' learning. So let's have an example of a rather current topic, hybrid teaching. And by hybrid teaching, I mean teaching where you've got some students working online and logging in remotely using, for example, Zoom or Teams or Google Classroom, etc. And the other part of the class working live with the teacher in a classroom. So this is an example where I'm trying to show what it means to learn, for the teacher to learn at those 3 levels that I've just described. So at level 1, awareness and inspiration, for example, a teacher would be considering things like, what is hybrid teaching and learning? What are the benefits and the challenges of hybrid teaching and learning? How can we address the challenges that hybrid teaching and learning bring about in our context? And what does successful hybrid teaching and learning look like? So, models of hybrid teaching. Now, interestingly, a lot of professional development activity ends here. And it leads to awareness, it inspires me, but it doesn't necessarily change my practice. So let's look at, with the same example of hybrid teaching, what this would look like in terms of working at level 2. So here is where I begin to use, to implement, to apply hybrid teaching, or to get ready for applying. So working at this level would be, for example, learning about using Zoom and conference cab webcams or any other type of technology that I would need to teach hybrid lessons. So here is where I need to know how to do it. Try out the procedure, and before I even go into the classroom, troubleshoot, problem solve, etc. Testing things like seating arrangements and camp placement in my classroom to make sure that everybody can see everybody. And ideally some joint lesson planning, so planning with my colleagues who are teaching the same level or the same type of class, and peer reviewing the lesson plans and giving each other peer feedback. So here already we're beginning to see the importance of collaborative teacher development in that journey towards applying what I'm learning as a teacher. Now let's look at level 3. And this is, as you remember, implementing and refining and evaluating and embedding the new practices in my school and in my organization. So this is, in the case of hybrid teaching, it would be first hybrid experimentation in class and noticing what's going on and capturing the impact of hybrid teaching on my learners. And here the peer collaboration happens in things like sharing problems, issues, challenges, raising questions, reflecting on what we have learned together, developing solutions with my colleagues, and planning the next stages. So in other words, and in a different way of putting it, awareness and inspiration can take place actually in a one-off professional development activity, like, for example, this plenary from me to you. But if I want you to apply what you're learning, then we need to think more about providing multiple opportunities for you as a teacher to rehearse, to test, to observe the impact of what you are applying, to practice more and more, to get feedback from colleagues about other pairs of eyes looking at the impact of what you are implementing on your learners. And then if I really want to make sure that my learners' learning is improved, then I need to increase the level of experimentation and sustained collaboration with teachers. So joint planning, teaching and co-teaching, evaluating together. So going back to this idea that sharing good practice is not necessarily impactful collaboration, this is because when we share good practice in the kind of settings that I've just described, you do generally achieve awareness and inspiration by the end of the session. So teachers become more aware of something new and they may become inspired to try it out. But what doesn't necessarily happen very much is that you actually effectively prepare your colleagues to use and to apply something new. And you also don't support the colleagues, and you're not supported as you implement what you have learned in your practice and you refine it. So let's now move on to the collaborative approaches for learning and innovating that can be, I believe, and I know, and we've tried in my organization, that do work for collaboration and for impactful collaboration. So I want to talk to you briefly about lesson study and about supported experiments. So let's get started with lesson study. Lesson study, it's been around for over 150 years, and it started in Japan, but it's become much more widespread all over the world, in the West, particularly through the work of Professor Peter Dudley at Cambridge University. And he defines it quite broadly by saying that it's a highly specified form of classroom action research focusing on the development of teaching practice knowledge. Dr. John Minert says it's a trial space where ideas can be created and explored and innovation can take place. I think what matters here is to remember that lesson study is by definition a collaborative approach, because it usually involves a group of teachers working together, typically in groups of 3. So what do? First, they plan together. So it may involve extended preparation. So, for example, training together, reading together, collaborating in the planning. Then it involves teaching, where they take it in turns to teach and observe each other teaching. And when I say teach and observe, I don't necessarily mean physically observing. It can be done perfectly through video-based observation. So the beauty of course, of video-based observation is that the 3 teachers don't have to be in the same room at the same time, which has implications for cover, etc. But you can actually watch a colleague's lesson when you have the time, when you are free. Then analyzing learning and teaching in those, what they're called research lessons, the lessons that your colleagues teach. And then recording your findings. And that, of course, has an impact on the planning of the next research lesson and so on. So let's have a look at a cycle. So if we look at the first cycle, it begins with a first meeting where the teacher group of 3 decides what they want to improve in their practice. That leads to joint planning of the first research lesson. Then one of the teachers teaches and the other 2 observe the first research lesson. And actually, if you do it via video-based observation, even the teacher that teaches the lesson is able to observe that lesson. Interestingly, it also, if you can, it's very useful to interview the students to understand even better the impact of that approach or innovation on their learning. And then a discussion and initial plans for research lesson 2. The second cycle is pretty much the same, but it's teacher number 2 doing it. So if teacher number 1 taught, now teacher number 1 observes and teacher number 2 teaches. And the same thing happens in cycle 3, in which case it's teacher 3 who teaches and the other 2 teachers observe. Hopefully, it leads to presenting findings to the group, the wider group of teachers. Now, I really like lesson study for many reasons. The first one is that the focus of the observations is much less on the teacher and much more on the learners and on the impact that change in teaching, that innovation has on the learners, which is what we were talking about when we were saying this is impactful collaboration. And let me just share with you the kinds of questions that you would be asking yourself and your colleagues after observing or while observing. Things like these. I'll let you read these questions in silence. So as you can see, there's a focus on the progress of each learner and looking at different learners. So this is a form adapted from Dudley that enables teachers to look at that. So you look at a case pupil in a way, an example of a pupil that's typical of a group of students that you want to study, then you observe another, teacher 2 observes case pupil B, and etc. Interestingly enough, I work for Bell, and we started implementing lesson study back in 2018. And this is one of my colleagues who started the cycle, Ken. And this is what he says, that it helped put the focus solidly on the students' learning as opposed to our own, as in teachers' perceived needs. And for him, this is quite interesting, I think, that it was interesting and less stressful to carry out research focused on student learning rather than on teaching, which is fascinating because, of course, it is, because we're looking at the students, not at me, not necessarily at what I do. He also said that the teachers that engaged in lesson study learned a lot about focusing on the learner, collaborating as teachers, and taking and incorporating learner feedback, this kind of learners' interviews. And he said a major positive was working closely with fellow teachers. And this is what I was saying about overcoming isolation. It was motivating and inspiring, he believed, and you can learn so much in terms of other ideas and perspectives. If you want to know more about our first attempt at lesson study at Bell, here is the link, Modern English Teacher. It was published, I think, in 2019, and you can read the article. Another interesting resource that you can download is Lesson Study, a handbook by Peter Dudley, and you've got a bit, sorry about that, it's not very clear, but it's www.lessonstudy.co.uk. Let's now move on to supported experiments. Supported experiments have been around for over, I would say, almost 2 decades. And Professor Jeff Petty was the first who developed the concept of supported experiments. He defines it as an approach to teacher development that provides an opportunity for teachers to try out new strategies. So there you've got the dimension of innovation with the support of a peer or expert colleague. So there you've got the concept of collaboration, who takes a coaching role, aids reflection, and provides feedback. So what happens during a supported experiment? A teacher tries a teaching strategy that's new to them, and the experiment is adapted and repeated until both the teacher and the students are used to the new strategy. This is not just repeating, but this is the kind of repetition that improves performance. So it's not just doing it again, it's deliberately doing things differently and better. During the trial, the teacher has supported discussions with peers. So here is the collaboration about the experiment, and they receive feedback and coaching, peer coaching. Then the teacher, when she or he feels ready, they report back to other teachers so that they too can learn from the trial. This is what we want to embed in our practice. The important thing to remember is that teachers can also carry out experiments in teams, providing support for each other and sharing experiences. So I'm going to look a little bit about the different stages of a supported experiment cycle. So the first stage is exploring the context. In other words, teachers considering issues and problems that impact on the students' learning, given the course that they teach, the learners that they teach, etc. So going back to the example of hybrid groups, let me share the experiments, the supported experiment that one of my colleagues did at Bell. So Anna was the first one to experiment with hybrid groups. And her problem was that in hybrid lessons, she felt that grouping students successfully was problematic because there were the online students working remotely, the face-to-face students in class with her, that groups were fixed with little variation. And it was very hard to get the two groups, the online and the face-to-face, to gel and work together as a whole class. So stage 2 is exploring present practice. So here teachers think about how they teach at present. So Anna was thinking that in group work activities, she typically grouped the online students together in breakout groups and the face-to-face students together. It worked during the activity, she felt, but the groups remained the same. So it felt like 2 separate classes rather than one. Stage 3 is exploring pedagogy. So here is where teachers find out and identify other strategies they could use that might lead to better learning. So this may require reading, research, talking to other colleagues, etc. So in Anna's case, she started considering and talking to her colleagues, including myself, and we concluded together that putting the students into hybrid groups, so not just online students with online students and face-to-face students with face-to-face students, but mixed groups. So breakout groups with online students and face-to-face students working together. So Anna planned experiments. teachers decide which new teaching strategy they will be trialing and how. And this is how Anna planned her experiment with our support and with our coaching. So she decided to plan and arrange a test of this new strategy of mixing the groups with colleagues. She set up and prepared the tech. She ran the test. She evaluated the test with her colleagues, and we concluded that it was really a good idea to do this. So we tweaked and ran adaptation past our peers. She ran a second test, and then she planned the first series of lessons, and she designed the experiment evaluation. The next stage is to carry out the supported experiments, and this is where teachers experiment with a new strategy and receive support from the peers. So this is what Anna did. She implemented hybrid groups, cycle 1, and at the same time, out of class, she was receiving feedback and support from me and another colleague. And through that, we observed her, we gave her feedback, and we agreed an action plan for adapting and improving practice, and that led to the second implementation. So here was what we said. We felt that the hybrid groups, as we had created them, had allowed the students to interact, participate, and complete tasks together smoothly. The students knew exactly what to do. It was amazing and got on with it very efficiently, and that everybody had normalized the procedure of hybrid groups by the end of the first week, which was amazing and fascinating. The problem was that face-to-face students were dominating speaking turns at the expense of online students. So we agreed an adaptation, and the adaptation was to introduce cooperative learning roles when working in hybrid groups. So the tweak was that that Anna gave her student different roles. So one, for example, was the manager leading the discussion. There was a timekeeper, there was a presenter, etc. Finally, the last stage of the supported experiment is to share strategies. This is where teachers report on the experiment and on what they have learned by experimenting. So this is what matters here, and this is why this kind of approach leads to improvement. It's not just a one-off, it's a series of professional developments where, first of all, we develop awareness and inspiration. We move on to using and applying with support, and then we look at the direct impact on the learners and their learning. And then we are ready to embed practice, so other teachers agreeing to implement the new and improved strategy. What I would say is that if you are a manager or a teacher educator, it's in your power to provide the conditions, the environment, the support, and the resources to make collaborative professional development happen. And if you are a teacher, what I would strongly suggest is that you don't settle for irrelevant, suboptimal professional development. Speak to your line manager, to your director of studies. Put yourself forward to try out collaborative approaches, offer ideas, seek feedback. And one last comment from me is that these approaches are not just for people who are into teacher research or, experts in methodology. They're for every teacher and every group of teachers. Every school could adopt one of these approaches. They're ideal for environments to make teacher development impactful. If that is what matters to you, then by all means, try it.